Scenery 8. Culture. Real scene 4. Literature. One day I wrote her name. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Vain man, said he, that doth in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize. For I myself shall like to this decay, and eke my name be wiped out likewise. Not so, quoth I, let baser things devise to lie in dust, but you shall live by fame. My verse your virtues rare shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name. Where, wheneth death, shall all the world subdue, our love shall live and later life renew. Edmund Spenser. My goal.
In this scenario, I will learn to use appropriately the structures of would rather and would prefer, also to use verbs with propositions, and to improve my knowledge about the history of Western literature.
Introductory questions. Number 1. What is the importance of the Greeks and the Romans in literature? Number 2. Who are the most famous writers in your country? Number 3. What kinds of books do you like reading?
Introduction. Literature and writing are not the same. That's the reason why the first writings from ancient Sumeria or the Egyptian hieroglyphics are not considered literature. If literature and writing are not synonymous, we have the problem to identify the beginnings of literature, mainly because many texts have been lost over the millennia, either deliberately, by accident, or by the total disappearance of the originating culture. Much has been written, for example, about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, and the innumerable key texts which are believed to have been lost forever by the flames. Fortunately, there are some primary texts that have a qualifying role as literature's first stirrings. As an example of it, there are early orally transmitted tales such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, 8th century BC, or Beowulf, that were eventually written down. The stories described in the Bible are also depicted as early literature, as do some that were orally transmitted and subsequently transcribed epics, such as the stories usually attributed to Homer, like the famous Odyssey, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was eventually written down in the Papyrus of Annai in approximately 250 BC, but probably dates from around the 18th century BC. Egyptian literature was not included in early studies because the writings of ancient Egypt were not translated into European languages until the 19th century, when the Rosetta Stone was deciphered.
Grammar structure 1. Would rather and would prefer. You use would rather or would prefer to state a preference followed by a base form of a verb, to say that someone prefers one situation to another. A. She would rather be sailing. B. I would rather walk than take the train. C. I would prefer to go sailing. D. I would prefer to walk than to take the train. Writing. Exercise. Make a question using would you like with the first of the phrases given below. Then write an answer using I would rather with the second phrase.
1. Have another drink. Get home early. 2. Start now. Wait a few minutes. 3. Go shopping this morning. Go this afternoon. 4. Pay cash. Pay by check.
The Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks. The importance of this civilization in our society is so big that many authors consider that with the epic poems of the Iliad and the Odyssey, Western society begun. And later with the poems of Sappho, who defined in many ways lyric poetry as a genre. We can't forget about Sophocles, who is recognised as skillfully developing irony as a literary technique, most famously in his play Oedipus the King. Also, Euripides, conversely, used plays to challenge societal norms and mores, hallmark of much of Western literature for the next 2,300 years and beyond. His works, such as the Bacchae and the Trojan Women, are still notable for their ability to challenge our perception of propriety, gender, and war. Philosophy entered literature in the dialogues of Plato, who converted the give and take of Socratic questioning into written form. Aristotle, Plato's student, wrote dozens of works on many scientific disciplines, but his greatest contribution to literature was his Poetics, which lays out his understanding of drama and thereby establishes the first criteria for literary criticism. The Romans. During the Republic and the Empire, authors chose to avoid innovation in favour of imitating the great Greek authors. As an example, Virgil in the Aeneid, in many respects, emulated Homer's Iliad and others more influenced by their religion, Greek and Roman polytheism. Ovid and his Metamorphoses explore the same Greek myths again in new ways. It can be argued, and has been, that the Roman authors, far from being mindless copycats, improved on the genres already established by their Greek predecessors. For example, Ovid's Metamorphoses creates a form which is a clear predecessor of the stream of consciousness genre. What is undeniable is that the Romans, in comparison with the Greeks, produced relatively few literary styles of their own.
Grammar Structure 2. Verbs with prepositions. Some verbs do not take an object and are normally followed by a preposition. Some verbs can take either an object or a preposition. Verbs that are normally followed by a prepositional phrase. Belong to, consist of, hint at, hope for, insist on, lead to, listen to, pay for, qualify for, refer to, relate to, sympathize for. Writing. Exercise. Use these verbs and prepositions in the sentences below. Refer to, suffer from, sympathize with, appeal to or appeal for, result in. 1. If you don't understand any of these words, you can always a dictionary. 2. All last winter he coughs and colds. 3. The police are the witness to come forward. 4. The accident on the I-95, sadly, the death of a child. 5. The poor driver, him, it wasn't his fault.
The medieval period. As we all know, with the fall of the Roman Empire around the year 476 AC, many things changed, and of course literature was not the exception. Most of the authors focused more and more on faith and faith-related matters, in part because the works written by the Greeks had not been preserved in Europe, and therefore there were few models of classical literature to learn from and move beyond. What little there was became changed and distorted, with new forms beginning to develop from the distortions. During that time, Islam spread across the continents of Asia and Africa, brought with it a desire to preserve and build upon the works of the Greeks, especially in literature. Although much had been lost to the ravages of time and to catastrophe, as in the burning of the Library of Alexandria, many Greek works remained extant. They were preserved and copied carefully by the Muslim scribes. In Europe, hagiographies, or Lives of the Saints, are frequently among early medieval texts. The writings of Bede, Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Alorgum, and others continue the faith-based historical tradition, begun by Eusebius in the early 300s. playwriting essentially ceased, except for the mystery plays and the passion plays that focused heavily on conveying Christian belief to the common people. Around 400 AD, the Prudente Sycomania began the tradition of allegorical tales. Poetry flourished, however, in the hands of the troubadours, whose courtly romances and chansons de jet amused and entertained the upper classes who were their patrons. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote works which he claimed were the histories of Britain. These were highly fanciful and included stories of Merlin the magician and King Arthur. Epic poetry continued to develop with the addition of the mythologies of Northern Europe. Beowulf and the Norse sagas have much in common with Homer and Virgil's approaches to war and honour, while poems such as Dante's Divine Comedy and Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales take much different stylistic directions. During the Renaissance, the focus on the acquisition of knowledge for learning's sake caused an outpouring of literature. Petrarch publicised the sonnet as a poetic form. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron made romance acceptable in prose as well as poetry. François Rabelais rejuvenates satire with Gargantua and Pantagruel. Michel de Montaigne single-handedly invented the essay and used it to catalogue his life and ideas. Perhaps the most controversial and important work of the time period was a treatise published by the Polish astronomer entitled De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. In it, Nicolaus Copernicus removed the Earth from its privileged position in the universe, which had far-reaching effects, not only in science, but in literature and its approach to humanity, hierarchy and truth. Plays for entertainment, as opposed to religious enlightenment, returned to Europe's stages in the early modern period. William Shakespeare is the most notable of the early modern playwrights, but numerous others made important contributions, including Christopher Marlowe, Molière and Ben Jonson. From the 16th to the 18th century, commedia dell'arte performers improvised in the streets of Italy and France. Some commedia dell'arte plays were written down. Both the written plays and the improvisation were influential upon literature of the time, particularly upon the work of Molière. Shakespeare and his associate Robert Armin drew upon the art of jesters and strolling players in creating new style comedies. All the parts, even the female ones, were played by men, en travesti, but that would change, first in France and then in England too, by the end of the 17th century. The epic Elizabethan poem The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser was published in the first part in 1590 and then in completed form in 1597. The Fairy Queen marks the transitional period which novelty begins to enter into the narrative in the sense of overturning and playing with the flow of events. Theatrical forms known in Spenser's time, such as the Mask and the Mummers play, are incorporated into the poem in ways which twist tradition and turn into political propaganda in the service of Queen Elizabeth I. Miguel Cervantes' Don Quixote has been called the first novel by many literary scholars, or the first of the modern European novels. It was published in two parts. The first part was published in 1605 and the second in 1615. It might be viewed as a parody of Le Morte d'Arthur and other examples of chivalric romance, in which case the novel form would be the direct result of poking fun at a collection of heroic folk legends. This is fully in keeping with the spirit of the Age of Enlightenment, which began from about this time and delighted in giving a satirical twist to the stories and ideas of the past. The Age of Enlightenment refers mainly to the period beginning towards the end of the 17th century and continuing on throughout the 18th. It could also be called the Age of Revolution. During this period, scientists and mathematicians revolutionized human understanding, the Industrial Revolution got underway, and the American and French political revolutions took place. During this period, philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Thomas Paine were concerned with the rights of man and with the meaning of rights. The arts also shared the concerns of the reason, its enlightenment and a new understanding of things. Literature explored themes of social upheaval, reversals of personal status, political satire, geographical exploration, and the comparison between the supposed natural state of man and the supposed civilized state of man. The 19th century was perhaps the most literary of all centuries, because not only were the forms of novels, short stories, and magazine serials all in existence side by side with theatre and opera, but since film, radio, and television did not exist, the popularity of the written word and its direct enactment were at their height. Johann Wolfgang Goethe published Part 2 of Faust. Gerald Douglas published The Factory Girl, The Golden Calf and The Rent Day. In 1833, Caroline Bowles published Tales of the Factories. Charles Lamb published Last Essays of Elia. The first modern Arabic combination of the Book of 1001 Nights was published in Cairo.
The middle of the century. In 1844, Alexandre Dumas published the novel The Three Musketeers, Les Trois Mousquetaires, and wrote The Count of Monte Cristo. Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist, 1837 to 1839. In 1850, Alfred Lord Tennyson became Poet Laureate, and Robert Louis Stevenson was born on November 13th. Two of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories were posthumously published, The Oblong Box and The Oval Portrait. In 1851, Le Fanu published Ghost Stories and Tales of Mystery. Herman Melville published Moby Dick, and James Fenimore Cooper died on September 14th of this year. Charles Dickens' prolific creative outpouring gave us David Copperfield, 1849 to 1850, and then Bleak House, 1852 to 1853, Hard Times, 1854, Little Dorrit, 1855 to 1857, A Tale of Two Cities, July 11th, 1859, and Great Expectations, 1860 to 1861. In 1862, Victor Hugo published Les Miserables. Henry David Thoreau died, and Edith Wharton was born. Dostoevsky published The House of the Dead and A Nasty Story. Christina Rossetti published Goblin Market and Other Poems, 1862. The late 19th century. In 1863, Jules Verne published Cinq Semaines en Ballon, 5 Weeks in a Balloon. Verne's Paris au XXe siècle, Paris in the 20th century, was written, but was not published until 1994. Voyage au centre de la Terre, Journey to the Center of the Earth, came out in 1864, and De la Terre à la Lune, From the Earth to the Moon, in 1865. Verne had by then fully established the scientific romance as a genre. Charles Dickens published Our Mutual Friend in installments from 1864 to 1865. Literature by this time was becoming increasingly popular. By then, the European and North American middle classes were better educated than ever before, and more reading was done. At the same time, the styles of writing were tending more and more toward plainer language and more broadly understood themes. People were reading about detectives, ghosts, machines, wonders, adventures, tricky situations, unusual turns of fate, and romances. Love stories and grudges, explorations and wars, ideas based on scientific positivism, and ideas based on nonsense and gibberish were all being published and enjoyed by a readership which could now be termed the masses. In 1865, Lewis Carroll published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, combining social satire with nonsense writing and presenting the two of them in the guise of a children's story. Thomas Chandler Halliburton died, and Edith Maud Eaton was born. Jules Verne published L'Enfant du Capitaine Grant, In Search of the Castaways, 1867 to 1868, and 20,000 Lieues sous la mer, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, in 1870. The Decadent movement was a transitional stage between Romanticism and Modernism. In 1874, Jules Verne published L'Île Mystérieuse, Mysterious Island. In 1875, Carmen, a French opera by Georges Bizet, with text by Henry Meilhac and Ludovic Allouet, reached the stage. Dostoevsky published The Raw Youth, or The Adolescent. In 1881, Dostoevsky died. Oscar Wilde published his first book of poems. Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Patience, or Gunther's Bridge, was staged. Mark Twain published The Prince and the Pauper. In 1884, Mark Twain published The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In 1887, Oscar Wilde published The Canterville Ghost. Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Rodigor, or The Witch's Curse, was staged. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published A Study in Scarlet. the first Sherlock Holmes story, and the beginning of crime fiction as a genre. H. Rider Haggard published She first serialized in The Graphic from October 1886 to January 1887. In 1888, Oscar Wilde published The Happy Prince and Other Stories. Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta The Yeoman of the Guard, or The Merryman and His Maid, was staged. Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas The Gondoliers, or The King of Barataria, 1889, Utopia, Limited, or The Flowers of Progress, 1893, and The Grand Duke, or The Statutory Duel, 1896, were all staged. Lewis Carroll's last novel, the two-volume Sylvie and Bruno, was published in 1889 and 1893 respectively. In 1889, Oscar Wilde published The Portrait of Mr. W.H. In 1890, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published The Sign of Four. H. Rider Haggard published The Saga of Eric Bright Eyes, an epic Viking novel. Oscar Wilde published The Picture of Dorian Gray. In 1891, Herman Melville died. Oscar Wilde published Lord Arthur Saville's Crime and Other Stories, Intentions and House of Pomegranates. In 1892, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. In 1893, Oscar Wilde staged two plays, Salome, French version, and Lady Windermere's Fan. His A Woman of No Importance and the English version of Salome followed in 1894. In 1894, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Robert Louis Stevenson died on December 3rd of this year. Mark Twain published Tom Sawyer Abroad and Pudd'nhead Wilson. Oscar Wilde was in prison for gross indecency from 1895 to 1897. In 1896, Giacomo Puccini's opera La Bohème was staged, as well as Chekhov's play The Seagull. H. G. Wells published The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau. William Morris died on October 3rd. Mark Twain published Tom Sawyer, Detective. Alfred Jarry, when he was 23 years old, wrote his highly influential play Uwe Roy, which is often cited as a forerunner to the theatre of the absurd. In 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. H. G. Wells published The Invisible Man. When the 19th century ended, the genres of horror, ghost stories, westerns, children's literature, crime fiction, science fiction, historical novels, and fantasy had all been established.
In the first half of the 20th century, writers such as Franz Kafka and James Joyce experimented with dislocations of conventional wisdom in their creations of distorted characters, locations, and narrative styles. Literary experiments matched those taking place in modernist painting and sculpture of the same period, and challenged the reader to re-examine and deconstruct preconceptions about the world. Bertolt Brecht created modernist theatrical productions according to his theory of the alienation effect, which was supposed to make the audience think and feel in new and critical ways by removing comfortable assumptions and not permitting the narrative to appear too much like reality. Research Spot. Look for more information about 1. Contemporary writers. 2. Literature classics. 3. Best libraries in the world.